You're gaining a son, so you have more testosterone in the family.
Well, good evening, people.
Good evening.
Good evening.
And welcome to our seminar. It's called the Modern Day Victory Garden. And our guest speaker is Dr. Jeff Briggs. And I'll start the evening out with prayer. Heavenly Father, we just come now before you, Lord, and we just ask that you bless this time together, Lord. Bless this learning session about how to grow your food, how to grow your fruit, which you created for us, Lord. Lord, now just help us to be attentive and help us to learn as much as possible, Lord. And we ask these things in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So, just in the days of old, Joseph heard the message of God through the Egyptian Pharaoh. This is in Genesis chapter 41, verses 29 and 30. It says, "Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in the land of Egypt, and after those 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land." That's the first warning he gave. Later in the 1st century AD, Agabus stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world, and in proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. That's in Acts 11, 28 and 29. In Matthew 24:7, Jesus said, "For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes." The watchman has cried out in Ezekiel 33, verses 2 through 4, "Son of man, speak to the sons of your people and say to them, if I bring a sword upon the land, and the people of the land take one man from among them, and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming upon the land, and he blows on the trumpet and warns the people, then he who hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, and the sword comes and takes him away, his blood will be on his own head." And we've had strong warnings given to us in today's day about the coming food crisis in the world. Many indications are that in July we'll start seeing major changes in our food supply, and by September it will be a crisis. Therefore, we need to take heed of the warnings and start growing food for the famine to come. Now let me introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Jeff Briggs, professor at North Greenville University, who is also my neighbor and my friend. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for that very, very pointed introduction. And it's probably obvious to all of us that times are getting a little difficult, seasons are changing, and you probably notice the moral and ethical decay in society or societies. You certainly don't have to go too far to turn the TV on to see the disarray globally. As an educator in higher education, I see many of the children who come out of primary and secondary education, and I can certainly tell you that there is a tremendous decline in the educational competencies and the capabilities of the children that are coming to college, and that provides a wonderful opportunity for guys like me and gals to disciple for the Lord the next generation. But I also at the same time see, this is my 26th year in higher education, and I also see through 3 decades a tremendous decline in the academic skills, but also just the talents and the parable of talents, just the talents that the next generation does not possess. And so if you ask my neighbors, I take a great many young men under my wings, and I bring them home and I teach them skills that their father never taught them, and then disciple them through that. And so again, you don't have to look very far to know there is a lot of things really wrong in this world. And in spite of the fact that the kingdom of God continues to spread, and it's the stone that crushed the great statue of Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom of God is spreading. The leaven is spreading. The enemy is still active and at work, and a ruler, and a principality in this particular kingdom, the kingdom of darkness, which constantly collides and battles with the kingdom of light. We get the fortunate opportunity to live through that. I'm certain of a lot of things. I'm uncertain today of a lot of uncertainty. And you're talking about a man here who likes to read and spends a lot of time in prayer and cognating about a lot of things. The greater uncertainties that I have today continue as I age in time. I used to think it would go the other way, and it's just the opposite of that. There's more ambiguity and uncertainty, I think, and I don't necessarily want to blame that on the downfall of mankind, but certainly we know that this world is coming to an end, whether we get the opportunity to see it or the privilege to be raptured out of it during our lifetimes. I can't say for certain. I do see a lot of macro evidence of the societies in the world moving from a unipolar world order, which is a one polarized world order, to more of a multipolar world order. And that actually would align with eschatological literature in the Bible. Although the Bible clearly identifies a new world order, but that would be derived out of several world orders in combative nature coming together. I think we would all agree, and I'm not at all going to make this about political or DC related things, but I certainly think we would all agree that criminal elites either are taking over or have taken over many of the systems of this world. And one of the folks I want to introduce you tonight is a gentleman that many of you might have been familiar with a ways back. His name was Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger in the 1970s, actually in the late 60s, it was published in the 1970s as he was meeting with world leaders. The phrase that was captured, and I don't know if it was meant to be captured publicly, because a lot of times those the ruling elites will say things publicly and then discuss and say things privately, and they're vastly different. But it was clearly captured, and it was written about and cited that Kissinger always noted that when you control oil, you control nations. But when you control food, you control people. Now, what kind of a spirit would encourage someone to think like that? How to control nations and control people. The world, I think, is in a state of disarray. And, here in Christian community, we would say, well, the harvest is a la plenty. People are ripe. And I believe the spirit behind Kissinger's notions of control are vastly working, and they're active. But on the other side of the aisle, so are we. And the kingdom of God is moving forward in many areas, and I believe we're making many inroads. I'm a part of another body in this community, and much like your body, we're very active in the things we're doing to disciple and to bring people into the faith and to go after the lost sheep, but also to unconditionally love in the hopes that the prodigals would return. Notice the father didn't go out after him. He waited. So in the parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin, there was intentionality to go out and look for it. But that third parable in Luke 15, he stayed home and he waited. And so we want to go after lost souls and lost sheep, and we really want to pray and unconditionally love and really in hope that our prodigal family members will return. They've got to make that decision. Every decision you make with Christ has to be an individual decision. The America that I live in today And I'm a finance guy, so I work at North Greenville University, and Dan asked me just to share a little bit about, this is not about me at all, but just my background is I'm a business guy. And I help train up students to start and run businesses, how to make money, how to be profitable, how to save money. So I'm a finance guy and a business operations, I'm a supply chain kind of individual. And I do a lot of work in the sport profession, the sport industry, but mainly my focus for the last 3 decades has been in enterprising and entrepreneurial aspects of business. Reflecting on the America that I live in, I've noticed for a couple of decades, but I really notice more than ever now. It seems like we export war, we export inflation, and we export terrible messages out of Hollywood. And I like to call them unholywood, by the way. So there might be some good folks there, but the messages that they portray are not very righteous. So the US dollar is tanking. It's being undermined in every aspect you could possibly imagine. I could talk to you about economics for hours. I do a couple of economic presentations for prepper groups, and one is the formation of fiat currency in the money system. And there's a lot of economic pain. I believe it's still inevitably in front of us yet. The America that I live in, I'm seeing the central banks really wield control. And as they rear their heads out of the sand, so for a long time, if you studied global economics and the central banks, they always worked behind the scenes. You never heard about the Japanese central bank or the Chinese central bank or the Indian central bank, or seldomly heard about our central bank, the Fed. You can't go by a day now and hear about dozens and dozens of messages coming from the central banks and to the central banks and the interactions that they have and how they move markets. It is amazing that the tail wags the dog in global economics, in the central banks, who are controlled and owned by the elites, by the way, if you're not aware of that. There's nothing federal about our reserve, and they have no reserves. They have a huge balance sheet, and they're desperately trying to unload it. Indebtedness. But there is something that I'm very interested in. I personally am a grower, was raised on a farm, and spent a lot of time in the fields. And so I have really fond memories. My grandfathers farmed for generations, my grandfathers, and they would tell me stories about the teams of horses and being out there late at night in the moonlight, and my grandmother would be up with my grandfather as he was doing the fields, and they told me the story about he sold his last team of horses and bought his first tractor, and I can still describe it to you, not that I need to, but boy, those stories are fun and meaningful and memorable, and it kind of connects me back. I was raised on a farm, and it was a little bit more modern farming in the 70s and 80s. Of course, that's not modern at all compared to today's 21st century big agri farming. My wife has an uncle, Uncle Roger owns 500 acres in Iowa. And that sounds like a big farm, 500 acres. To many of us, it probably is. It's one of the smaller farms in the area. Big Agri has been buying up the farmland in and around the Quad Cities in Iowa for quite a while. And there's a lot of takeover with the Big Agri buying up all the seeds rights and the patents for the seeds and the user rights, and then Monsanto moving in, and really everybody working together to basically put all the smaller farms out of businesses and just to basically centralize farming so that you're dependent on them. Centralize seed and grain and food, and to GMO, to manufacture DNA that you would eat regularly, and who knows what it does to you, so that they can control you, which is what Henry Kissinger, I don't want to use the word prophesied, let's just say he prognosticated in 1970. When you control the food, that's how you can control people. It's always been the plan of the enemy, the plan of the elites who are being used by the enemy to take over not just nations, not just corporations, but your own individual lives. You will have an electronic ID very soon. You will have it. You will have electronic means of doing commerce very soon. It's called Central Bank Digital Currency, CBDC. Now, you might just be hearing about it now, but let me just clue you in that by the time the media is actually releasing the information, it's already done and in place. And that's been their MO for a very long time. Let me tell you, they've been testing central bank digital currency going all the way back to 2014. And I do a lot of research in this area, and I try to uncover as much as I can. And they've been testing bank bail-ins and bailouts and bank holidays and moving people to digital currencies and perfecting the digital wallets. And I can already tell you, even one of the systems they're going to use, which is XRP, which is on the Ripple system. And so you may have seen that our governments, there was some litigation that dealt with that at the federal level. The SEC had some significant litigation. And anytime that federal governments are involved in litigation, they'll make sure that the information is kept and quieted. And so I was able to track that and some of the other things. And I know, and I'm not just speaking out of hubris, I know that when they cap and quiet that sort of thing, that's because they don't want you to know what they're really doing, because you would object to what they're really doing. Now, that's not the silencing that big tech is doing. That's something different. When they keep information from you, they know you will reject and revolt. So they control you by keeping you in the dark and then feeding you alternative propaganda that has no meaning or value to it. You and I both know that 100% of what comes out of the legacy media is designed to direct you. Remember, it's the Lord that directs our steps, not the communication of the enemy. And I've gone to many groups and I've had to tell them, you need to turn off the channels of the enemy and stop listening to their communication. And you need to tune into the channels of God and figure out where he's going and what he's doing. Now, I'm not chastising you, I'm challenging you in such a way as I'm trying to help you become aware. Now, let's go back to El Principio. In the beginning, God. And if you go back to original Hebrew language and you begin to translate Genesis 1, in the beginning there was God, and it stops right there. And so then God tells the story, and he says, principally speaking, here's the beginning of the story that I want you to be aware of. God created. Now, as you begin to move through that Genesis 1 and that parallel look from a different perspective, Genesis 2, as a grower, I like to zone in on the gardening aspects. God planted a garden in the east of Eden. That means he had some architectural designs for gardening. He spent a lot of time in it. He assigned personnel to work it. Remember, Adam showed up, he had a job description, here's what I want you to do this, do that. Again, the narrative doesn't give a lot of detail, but let's assume our God has a lot of detail to provide. He just didn't write it all down. He cultivated and organized it. I'm gonna have these trees here and these bushes here and this water here, and this water's gonna flow out of it and it nourishes this, and the water's gonna flow out and nourishes other things. So he thought about natural resources that flowed in and out of the garden. He walked in the garden. You see, throughout the scriptures, I'm pretty certain our God was a master gardener. And although you can go downtown to Greenville County and you can take the master gardener class from Clemson, I get to hang out with the master gardener. Jesus even knew that. I'm the vine and he's the master gardener. Now, obviously, there's other implications to those stories, yes. But again, from a grower, I like to think of my father in many ways, and not just as a teacher, and not just as the disciple, or not just as the creator. He was the master gardener. His son taught frequently using agricultural terms and references and stories. His son being Jesus. Now, I'm not going to subdivide the Trinity. We all know that they were one and the same. But obviously, the son, Jesus, spent a lot of time with God the Father because he knew to teach in agricultural means. You know, I spent a lot of time with my dad growing up, and I picked up a lot of things from my dad because I spent a lot of time with him. I tend to believe that maybe Jesus spent a lot of time in the gardens because his dad hung out there. Now, again, I'm overemphasizing and surmising. But I do know that Jesus talked about sowers and sowing and reaping and weeds and wheat and grain and vineyards and fallow ground and rocky soil and great soil and dirty and clean barns and threshing and figs and olive groves and mustard seeds. And, you know, he didn't talk about big tech. He didn't talk about emails. He didn't talk about sports, the Olympics, golf, the Masters. I heard Tiger started well, but I don't know how it finished, but I'm a sports guy. Jesus talked about gardening a lot. He talked about there's a lot of money in the Bible. I like to spend a lot of time looking at the business and financial implications, but he talked a lot about food and growing and farming. Now, that should make sense. Much of Jesus's audience were farmers, growers. They worked in agrarian-based businesses. The truth is, I can't wait to get to heaven because I think I'm going to go work on the farm. I can't wait. But that's me who Jesus is talking to in these many examples, because I'm a grower and I'm a homesteader and I'm a member of the preparedness community. And so as an active member of the preparedness community, I'm here tonight to welcome you to the introduction of the modern day Victory Garden. And I think we're going to have some fun. So let me just say thanks to Dan and Pastor for organizing, allowing us to come into your facilities and be joined together today. I want to ask you a question. And I tend to be an active teacher, professor, leader in the classroom. So I want to make this somewhat dialogue-ish tonight as well as monologue-ish. It means I want to speak to you and share some things that God has given me. But I want you to engage. And I want you to engage because I value your input. I want you to engage because I really want you to get a lot out of it. But I also know this from studying learning styles for a couple of decades. When people engage in something, they're more likely to retain it. They're more likely to grab it. They're more likely to make it their own. So I want you to own this tonight. You're not here just to hear from Jeff. We're here to grow and mature and find out what God is saying and maybe learn some things and maybe make some new friends and build our network and see where this goes. So let me just ask you this. Dan noted it. Are we really moving toward food shortages? Now, that's not just a rhetorical question. I'm asking you just to think about that now for a minute. Are we headed toward food shortages? Now, you don't have to raise your hand. Shout out your first impression to me. Just shout it out. You're all friends in here.
Well, normally it isn't shortages. It's a lack of being able to get something where it belongs.
Okay, so the supplying of. But in the end, it would be that we would experience the shortage as a result of transportation or other related matters. Yes, okay. I heard yes over here. What leads you to believe that?
Because if the Democrats have their way, they want to control us. And
Okay.
that's exactly what you said.
And we don't want to chastise any one individual party tonight, but that's okay. Listen, I'm not ignorant to the world we live
He
in,
said to speak freely.
but that's okay. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I had an observation. We traveled, when was it? I guess it was last summer. But I raised on a farm,
Yeah.
Midwest. I've gardened my whole life. And I know what it's like for the government to subsidize farmers and set aside programs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
We traveled to Missouri, we traveled to Kansas and back. Across 6 states. And I my life have never seen anything like what we saw. We went by field after field after field after field with nothing growing in it. Nothing. That was not a set-aside program. Set-aside program, the government pays
Yep.
for crop rotations and to,
Yep.
you know. And I would say, I'm guessing 50% of the fields were standing empty. I was like, what is going on? This is, we're talking Missouri, Arkansas, what did we pass? I mean, Tennessee, it was like, I was like, what's going on? And then, you know, you hear the stories of, like, someone, what's his name, buying up more land than now,
Yes.
Gates owning more land in America now than the National Parks Department, which, you know, they are the biggest landowner as well. So I was just like flabbergasted. So I something's up. That's all I have to say.
So firsthand experience.
Yeah.
Firsthand information, wonderful observations. Let's continue on, and then we'll make sure we key off of that. Are we headed toward food shortages? Is the
planned.
thing you need to ask yourself. Go ahead.
It's planned.
Okay, that's an impression.
I believe.
What leads you to believe that?
I believe they're planning,
Yeah.
because this is part of their control system. When they start talking about it's gonna come,
Yeah,
they have inside information.
yeah. Or what did I just say earlier is that by the time it's being communicated publicly through the legacy media, it's already been installed, instilled, and it's happening.
Every market is manipulated
Yeah.
by insiders. So I believe that probably the food market is being.
I heard they're already paying people to burn their crops.
Yes, that's accurate.
And
I can
also-
verify that not to plant, to till it up or tear it up, or even to extinguish their animals, yes.
And the cost of fertilizer's gone from $200, I'm not sure it's per acre, to
So
$1,200.
there's tremendous inflation
So
with
farmers can't farm.
seed, fertilizers, pesticides, all controlled by Big Agri.
Right.
And if you don't follow that, you need to, because Big Agri owns a lot of the land that we just heard about earlier. Most of the smaller farms that Midwestern Americans owned for generations have been bought up and now owned by a small handful of global corporations. Most of them aren't even resident in North America. And again, if you don't drive around and you don't see this, you're kind of unaware of that. Why are we unaware of it? Because we got too much of legacy media talking to us and not enough of other truth media or other things going. Yeah, so, yeah. What about food shortages? Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you.
How the farmers are being squashed out. And
Dairy,
dairy.
Yeah.
And like in Michigan too, I noticed that when I was living there. And, you don't see cows anymore.
Right.
You know, they're just not
Oh.
there. I mean, they're not.
All they had to do was change, all they had to do was change the centralized where they could, who was picking up the milk. And it forced farmers that have been family farms for hundreds of years, they're out, they're selling.
Yeah.
They've got nowhere to take their milk. Yeah.
So in relationship to the animals, you may or may not know, but Big Agri and Biomed have been working for about 4 decades to genetically manufacture and modify the DNA structure of animals and seeds so that we could reproduce them, we could actually produce them. And I talked about this in a seed workshop I did about a month ago. They have genetically been able to recreate meat and salmon and fish and many products that they're selling publicly. If you go to Burger King, you can buy the meatless hamburger. And I encourage you to go and seriously investigate what it is you're eating in that meatless hamburger, and the scientists that engineered the DNA structures that actually comprise that, and many other meatless products that have been approved by the FDA that are being purported and used and supplied throughout the world today. The disappearance of bees has been well noted over the past 5 to 10 years, but certainly the disappearance of large livestock farms is because we're bioengineering that stuff. And somebody noted that our Microsoft friend has been doing a lot of things behind the scenes. Of course, he's not well liked in Africa, and that's another story, but certainly the single largest individual owner of farmland, healthy, rich farmland in the world, here in America, is cause for not alarm or concern, but certainly informational awareness. Let's also remind ourselves that the U.S. imports a great deal of our grains and our seeds and our fertilizers, our fruits and our vegetables and our meats. I know for a fact, I've spent a lot of time on the FDA website. I'm one of those kind of researchers who I go to the FDA website and I look at their tables and their charts and their graphs, and I try to get as far as I can to see how the data was processed and analyzed, and even right down to some of the statistical package, the inferential statistics they use on them, to make sure that they're properly reporting it. Now, I'm not going to contrast that. I would certainly hope that you, let me see, I would certainly hope that we're all aware it's hard to trust government data. How's that? Okay, but somebody who spends a lot of time on the FDA website, Mexico is responsible for at least half of all of our fruits and vegetables. And the FDA reports that we have an agricultural trade surplus. That means that supposedly we sell more than we buy. Again, that could be numerical gaming. Not sure I support that. I'm not here to denounce our government at all. But I can certainly challenge data. And I'm allowed to do that, and I'm trained to do that. Consider, in the notion of the food shortages conversation, consider all the people that are moving to America. There seems to be an influx of people coming here both legally and maybe even nefariously to America.
You can say it illegally.
There's trucker and transportation issues. We just witnessed that publicly. Now notice that story in about 2 weeks moved off the news cycle. Once the financial constrictions occurred, and all of a sudden lots of people's accounts were frozen. Those who contributed, the accounts were frozen. And by the way, if you don't know the backstory, the banks, the three of the big banks, Barclays and a couple others, noticed that people were pulling their money out. It's called a bank run. And the significant banks had to call the PM in Canada and say, hey, you gotta stop doing this. And it was the banks that pulled the strings of the PM to quickly remove that. It tells you who really runs government. Consider the supply chain issues, international trade and sanction related things. And even if you want to change the perspective or paradigm for a minute, consider the notions of Agenda 2021 or 2030, that's sustainable development to end poverty and hunger. Consider the voices that are coming out of the World Economic Forum or the Council of Foreign Relations, and it's no longer just leaking voices, it's public pronouncements, it's public videos, it is press releases, Bilderberg's groups that America must fall, the dollar is going to go to be worthless, and our human rights are being stripped from us. And so then when you you back up and you take a little bit larger macro perspective, and then you ask yourself, well, if Henry Kissinger 50 years ago was prognosticating that the best way to control people is to go after the food that greatly influences their lives, isn't it safe to say that there's probably going to, at some point in time, either in the near or distant future, going to be food issues? I mean, isn't it safe to have that consideration? However, whether you think it's famine that's coming upon us, if whether you believe it's overpopulation that's crowding us, maybe you think the GMOs are destroying our bodies. Yes, there's a lot of markets managed. I like to use the word managed. It comes out of business, but you can substitute manipulated. Finances are constantly finagled. Maybe you believe that the Great Western Experiment is coming to an end. In any of those perspectives, all of those roads lead to the same point. And that's why we're here tonight. That's why we've come together. Now, let me bring you forward a little bit. And I studied, of the many things that interested me, as a grower, it is fascinating to go to World War II in the notion of the Allies coming against the Axis nations. And here in America, we were experiencing, coming out of this great depressive state, the war machine being turned on, and all of our national efforts being centralized and funneled and focused on the war. Now, in some regards, that form of solidarity brings people together. Nationalism unites people. We know that after 9/11, that for 6 months, the churches were full of people praying and pleading to the Lord, and it brought a lot of people back. Nationalism and solidarity in the face of crisis, it often caramelizes people to come together in unison. We row together, we see together, we effort together. There's no idleness. I am fascinated that one of our U.S. government's, what I think to be greatest efforts in involving civilians in supporting in a patriotic manner the war was the notion of promoting the Victory Garden. And so with a food shortage in the early 1940s, our U.S. government, and back then it was probably fairly well trusted. Back then, our government was fairly well trusted. The government officials put together a program, and they funded it, and they supported it, and they subsidized it, and they gave out grants and subsidies. They really did something really, really good. They responded to a problem in unison by going to the people and saying, let us show you how to help patriotically support the war effort. And so the government put together materials to teach people how to grow and how to garden. And little agri, not big ag, little agri companies came together and put money behind it. So the government subsidized and underwrote it. The corporate agri came together and underwrote it, and they didn't just put pamphlets together. They actually went out and taught people how to garden and provided subsidies to communities, and they wrote checks, and they put together materials, and they really tried to help people grow food, some of which could be supportive of the war efforts, some of which could then support the family. The government stepped in and said, we're going to hand you a fishing pole, and we're going to teach you how to fish, and we're going to point you to a pond and help you do it. Now that totally wipes out the entitlement class and programming that we see so often that kind of makes our stomachs churn a little bit. And I think that's a wonderful response. Teach people how to contribute and then become self-supportive and self-sustaining simultaneously. There were over 20 million victory gardens by 1944, 1945. 1 out of every 7 people became growers between 41 and 45, which produced over 40% of all of the vegetables that came out of this country. We also taught people to eat local produce. And you hear the phrase today, I'm going to give you a handout in a minute, and I wrote it down. It said, support your local growers. They were teaching people to support their local growers, to barter with one another, and to buy from one another, and to help each other grow. Billy would come over to Susie's house. Susie would go to Jimmy's. Jimmy and his family would help Michael, and we would all help each other grow. It's kind of what we're doing now with prepper groups. We're trying to help each other, maybe go back a couple of generations to what was fairly common practice in society. government funded. President Roosevelt would have his fireside chats. He would get on the radio and he would talk directly to people. You know, Donald Trump tried that through Twitter. He talked directly to people. And big tech silenced him. The government taught people how to scrap, how to recycle. They offered things like war bonds and war stamps and victory mails, lots of programs, and people came together in solidarity. It was fun. But the Victory Gardens helped people also because back then food was being rationed and y'all had coupon books back then. I actually have a few in my collection. I should have brought one. I'm going to pass around some materials here in a minute. In fact, let me start those. These are reprints from actual promotional pieces that the government and subsequent groups would use to promote the Victory Gardens. You could look at the language in there. It's fascinating from a communication and marketing perspective. Yeah, just let those pass around. Victory Gardens helped people who were really struggling because back then food was being rationed nationally. You had a coupon book and you could only pull it out and go get one loaf of bread and one thing of sugar every other week. And so people would receive the ration books and sugar and coffee and butter and meats and a whole slew of the canned goods. You know, there wasn't a lot of canned goods back then. It was still fairly new in society. Now, as a finance guy, I realized that even if you had money back then, if you didn't possess the coupon book, you couldn't buy your rations. Now just think about that for a minute. If you didn't have the right kind of fiat currency, you couldn't transact in the marketplace. That's what that tells me. Now you've heard me say in the financial discussions that I have, eventually the fiat dollar's going away. And they're going to force you into central bank digital currency. And the only way you'll be able to do commerce in the marketplace is if you possess the right instrument, the one that they control. So even at the Victory Gardens and the food rationing back in the 40s was a form of centralized control. We did trust the government back then. Now, just contrast that for a minute today. I think the president came out and several of his staffers and they said, hey, there's food shortages coming. Good luck, folks. Hope you survive. Have a nice day. That was the message they're sending today. Contrast that with the government's message in the 40s that says, let us help you out and show you how to survive and come together. So in our country, we're blessed. We have farmland that stretches all across the nation. But unfortunately, farmers and ranchers only comprise about 1% to 2% of all of the employed individuals in the United States. Now in the 1820s, 90% of all the people in America farmed and ranched. By 1939 or 41, when we had the start of Victory Gardens, let me see here, I'll get my numbers right. By the peak, we had 7 million farms. Today we're less than 2 million farms. That's a 75% decline in growers in this country. Now, putting all other information aside, if we got a lot more mouths coming into the country, and our appetites are a bit bigger, and our farmers and growers are doing this, I'd say without looking at any other information, there's probably going to be some food shortages coming, folks. So with all that in mind, I'm certain there's a lot of people in our society that haven't done much in the ways of preparing for challenging times. I'm assuming you're here tonight because you do have interest in preparedness. You do have interest in understanding what can be done and where you want to go. And I would tell you that doing nothing can no longer be an option in any of your lives. Now I like to sit around and pray and meditate and wait on the Lord, but I won't classify my idleness as waiting on the Lord, because the Lord chastises idleness. And he's given you a brain and strength, and he expects you to use it. And too many people today, and I'm not chastising them, but I'm telling you, the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. And it's a blessing to go after it and find it. It's better than silver and gold. And I remember the stories of my grandfather and my grandfather's grandfather. And one of the things that drove Jeff Briggs in 2009 back into gardening, I've been doing this now seriously 13 years as a homesteader, was that I came to the realization that I don't possess nearly the talents that my grandfather had and my father had and my great-grandfather. And I realized as a university professor and an administrator making a significant income, really having I realized that if and when times got tough, that I was easily eliminated and unemployable. And I thought to myself for months, maybe even years, that I needed to get some stuff that I didn't have. I'm talking skills, talents, abilities, and not just the stuff I store on a shelf. Know-how, knowledge and wisdom. That's what drove me personally. Coming from a farming background, I had some historicity, but it needed to be reawakened. And the Lord jolted me in 2009. You see, a forward-thinking person never relies on the government to solve his or her problems. Let me tell you, one day you're going to call 911 and they're not going to answer. And there's a sense of self-reliance that's been lost in this society. And I'm not claiming independence from God. I would call it interdependence. Working with God and interdependent working together in community. It's clan living. You can go back in the Old Testament. They survived and lived through clan living. It's pretty common practice. We've just gotten away from it. Now let me take a breath and stop for a minute. I do have a handout, and I do want to turn to some practical aspects. I do like to talk business and economics and philosophy, but it has no value unless it's paired with some practical action. So the pragmatheo. So when you compare and contrast the original Victory Garden and the designs, the nature and the need of it, today's Victory Garden, I would think that the elements that motivated people are fairly consistent both then and now. We don't have a major Axis war that's a kinetic war, but we have wars going on in a variety of theaters and fronts that should drive you to begin to think about how can you support yourself. And most households will spend up to 30-40% of their income on food on a regular basis. By growing your own food, learning how to dehydrate and can and freeze and to produce some of that stuff, you can begin to cut down on the economic demand, and as economics get tougher in society, you can begin to self-supply and manage that a little bit better for your own personal family and your own household. I have been a serious grower for 13 years, and I have only a 0.6 of an acre property in a middle-income family subdivision. And on the outside, it might look like a bunch of flowers and things on the front, but when you come in the gated fenced back, you would basically see fruit orchards and growing beds and growing tunnels and compost bins and rain barrels and seed-saving devices and all kinds of stuff that I've spent the last 13 years developing the systems and the practices, putting it together. I feel like we're getting close, my family and I are getting close to becoming highly self-sufficient in the area of seasonal food. Now we have seasons that change here. We live in a zone, growing zone 7B, and we're fortunate that's one of the growing zones that you can grow year round. And I grow a lot of stuff year round. In the dead of winter, I can go out and pick spinach and lettuce and onions and a handful of things and bring it in. That can be grown under the tunnels. And so we're fortunate that we live in an area where the environment allows for year-round growing. But I want to talk a little bit about the practical side. And most people would ask, well, how do we get started doing this? This sounds good, and you know, but I don't know where to start. So I'm going to take you through some steps and that I've laid out for you. And then once I get through it, I promise you, I'll stick around as long as you want to ask questions and do Q&A, because growing food, there can be about a million directions you can go with it. Seeds and companion planting and fertilizing and compost. I mean, just so much there. We don't have time for that, but I want to help you get started with your own victory garden. So I would tell you the same thing that the Lord showed me, was you need to start simple. And to start simple is you sit down and you kind of look at your space allocation, whatever space you have, and you're looking for space that gets a lot of sun, 6 to 8 hours at a minimum. Whether you have a lot of property or just a small area based on your woods or wooding, but you need to kind of lay it out on paper. And there's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of an engineering aspect and looking at the sundial. You can go into some things on the web and see where you get the most sun and arrays of sun, stuff like that, and sunrise and sunset, and you can kind of base that location for potentially your victory garden based on the square footage of real estate you have to dedicate. If you have very little, then there's ways around that. You know, in the 1940s, the original victory garden, it's fascinating stories. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but people that lived in apartments, they grew in containers. Well, that's no different than today. If you live in a townhouse or in a retirement community, or you live in a high-rise and all you have is a 5x5 porch or a 10x10 balcony, you can do a lot of container gardening there. Schools in the 1940s would grow food and contribute some to the government, and then some to the school food supply for the kids. Even businesses would grow on their roofs, and that's no different to today. If you go to certain communities, you can see lots of growing going on top of businesses. And so there's square footage that gets a lot of sun that can be easily converted and utilized. But I would tell you to start simple. There's 9,000 things you can grow, and you're not going to figure them all out at once, and not everything grows in this area. And so one of the things about starting simple is starting to figure out, okay, what is it I want to grow? And that question can be simply answered by this: what do you like to eat? And that's the number one recommendation I give to people when they begin to select crop and product is grow what you like to eat. And you're not going to be able to grow chocolate or ice cream. Yep, sorry. So it's easy to bite off more than you can chew. I did that. Know what that's like. Walked through that. Got the scars to prove it. And got lost in trying to grow way too much in the first 5, 6, 7 years. Began to really kind of harden in on the things that grow best here in the upstate, things that grow best in the Travelers Rest area, things that grow best not in the clay that we have, but above ground. I do the raised beds, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But you really need to kind of process, just sit down with your spouse or your family and say, hey, what do we like to eat that we can grow? And then figure out the seasonality, because not everything grows year round. Everything's got seasons based on temperature and humidity and sun. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. But obviously you need a location with 6 or more 8 hours of sun. More sun, the better. You can grow some things in shade, but it gets a little more challenging. There are 3 kinds of gardening types that you would want to consider for your victory gardening. The traditional, classic, for generations has been the in-ground gardening, and the in-ground gardening works great when you're in Iowa and you got dark soil, and you're in Michigan and your soil's black and it tills up real easy. In Ohio, we had farmland. It was just gorgeous. My dad would take a plow out there and he just would turn it over, and it would be just these big hunks of black, beautiful black dirt. It was just magnificent, but we don't have that down here. We have difficult clay. And so the in-ground gardening would be difficult down here unless you till it up and refill it. And I don't encourage that because that's very expensive. In-ground growing is a faster way to start, but it's going to be more laborious here in the upstate. It does require a lot of tilling and grading and pulling the rocks and weeds. And you can grow in 8+ hours of sunlight then, just about anything in-ground growing. Most growers in this area, unless you're a farmer with farm implements, they generally are not going to grow in ground because of the laborious difficulties and the soil challenges that we face. So therefore, that promotes us to either be container gardeners or raised bed gardeners. So container gardeners, for those of you who have never considered growing food, it is merely just putting something in a container and growing it. And so I grew all these over the winter. This is peppermint, and this is Greek oregano. I just grow them in containers. I started these as seeds 3 and 4 months ago, and I just put the potatoes in potatoes, and here's hot peppers, and same thing with beans. And then I can transplant these into a bigger pot, or you can put them in the ground when they're ready, when the dirt warms up and they're ready to go. But container growing is really not that difficult. They make a variety of size of containers. Obviously, for instance, in the bag containers, Dan and some others are using bags. I've used bags before, and bags work effectively, but you can see containers are easy to move around. They're very inexpensive. You can buy plenty of those very inexpensively. They last through the long haul. They're already perforated, so when you water will flow through and it doesn't get built up and then rot the roots. So container gardening is a great option to start with pots and planters and various other bags and things like that. So these bags, if you put them under the scope, they've got the ability to allow the water to drain a little bit, and they won't overheat easier. So one of the things you have to be careful of is that some of the wrong kinds of fabrics can overheat and dry out the roots. Containers do drain quickly and dry out quickly, and therefore the roots can get damaged and die on you. Or if they're not perforated, the water can pool in there and the roots would rot. And so in either instance, you wouldn't have growing success. But for those that have space challenges, all you have is a balcony or a patio, or you're really not interested in doing acres and acres of gardening, but you just want to start out with a few things, then go with some simple containers. And several of us can help you source containers and start. You can start small and transplant from a small container to a larger container, or you can start several seeds in a larger container. It reduces the need for a yard, so I can be a grower and don't have to go in the yard. I mean, obviously you can plant in pots and containers or different materials. I've seen people cut off the milk jars and drill holes in them and clean them out real good, and all kinds of barrels and buckets and things like that. And it's hard to grow large-scale crops in containers. So large-scale crops like corn that have an interesting root system, or stuff like squash, zucchini, your melons, your cucumbers, your cucumbers, things like that, where the roots go, it seems like miles. Those kind of things can't be done in your smaller containers. So there is I wouldn't say a limited crop selection, but there are some limitations with crop selection in container gardening. Just be conscious of that. You can grow tons of herbs and flowers and small crops, lettuce, radish, spinach, all those kind of things. I grow a lot of kohlrabi and Swiss chard and all kinds of stuff in containers through the winter that do just fine. So when I can't utilize the above ground beds due to the cold or the freeze or difficult inclement weather, you can certainly use containers to your advantage. And that's how I'm able to grow year round. And listen, I don't have any real formalized training in growing and gardening. I was raised on a farm, and I watch a lot of YouTube. And there's a lot of gardeners that have great channels. Pinterest gives me great ideas. And again, I'm not really fine arts oriented, so I need ideas. I'm not really an idea person. I'm a builder, and I follow through with things. And so I know how to get it done, and I get it done with excellence, but I need ideas and I need help. So YouTube, Pinterest, and gardening channels work real well. There's lots of them out there that produce the content. I don't need to produce the content. I can go watch what somebody else does. But container gardening is really popular in certain regions of the country. I do see it a good bit here in the upstate. For those that don't want to expend on expensive wood or other frameworks to build raised beds. I've seen some wonderful garden arranges with lots and lots of containers. But my favorite is the raised beds. You can generate a larger grouping of crops, and you can interplant your crops, and you can multi-season plant, but it lifts basically the level of your growing, and you basically put a box on top of the ground. And then you grow in the box, and you can make the box as tall as you want. And if you have a hard time bending over, the taller the box or the taller the frame, the easier it is to get to. So all of my boxes are 12 inches high or higher, and I like to grow above ground. Of course, I tilled up the dirt under it and the grass and got rid of the rocks and the weeds. So there's no-till gardening where you can put down cardboard. You can put down mulch and it kills the grass and stuff like that, and then you can build on top of it. You can hugoculture garden where you're using lots of decaying wood and all kinds of things, and I've actually done some of that, filled some of my beds with hugoculture kind of stuff to help fill the space. You don't have to have 16 inches of dirt. Remember, most crops root in the first 3 to 4 inches, so your best dirt needs to be at the top, and your filler mulch and filler stuff that stores water and nutrition can be in the lower 3/4. But I want to make sure grass doesn't go into mine. We have a lot of Bermuda, and Bermuda travels really well, and it's hardy. And the first few years I was growing, the Bermuda kept getting in there, and I would fight with it constantly. Well, now I've done a trench around, and I've put rock down, and it's got walking paths, and so I have taken care of the Bermuda. But boy, I fought with the Bermuda the first few years. So you do have some barriers if you're going to grow in this area. Make sure the grass is not going to disrupt your habits. But you can use a variety of products to build your raised beds. I've seen telephone poles used. I've seen railroad ties used. I've seen the fancy metal frame boxes used. I've seen people pour concrete frames and put them together. I just use lumber, and I stain it on the outside. It looks pretty. My wife and I like the look and design of it, and I'm not overly concerned about stuff seeping in or through or out of the lumber into the beds. The lumber it'll decay in 6-7 years. About every 6-7 years I replace one of my beds as it tends to fall apart. I'll repurpose the wood somewhere else on my property. But raised beds give you the most variety and opportunity if you can't plow and go into the ground. And as long as you have 8 or more hours of sunlight, you can grow just about everything possible that does grow in zone 7B. And that's, again, we have one of the greatest growing capacities here. But for us urban growers and urban farmers, I've seen concrete pavers used as grown beds. I still see them on rooftops, even in the community. So a lot of things are possible depending upon where you want to place your stuff and where your sunlight comes from. But you do need to select your gardening type, and it needs to be contingent on your sunlight location and the quality of your sunlight. And then once you've kind of figured that out, and again, I put that on paper, it's time to review your seasonal growing chart. And I've kind of put some information down there. I've given you the Clemson Cooperative Extension, their website. Clemson has a phenomenal agricultural arm, the extension, that just really is dedicated to growers and gardeners and farmers and homesteaders. And every crop you can imagine, they've detailed information, and they tell you when to start and when to start seeds and when to put it in the ground. They give you all the information about how to best fertilize for individual crops and what grows best, and every variation of every crop you can possibly imagine. And it's easy to get lost in variations because there's 19,000 kinds of green beans. Who would have known that? Yeah, there's hundreds, I kid you not, hundreds of different types of green beans. And anyways, it's just amazing. So I've given you some information there on the region we reside in is the Piedmont region, the first frost date, the last frost date. It's important to know that so that when you start your growing, when you end your growing, you have to be within the frost date limits. Otherwise, the frost will bite your plants. I have to cover things constantly. We had 2 frosts in the last 5 weeks, and even I spent probably the half of that Saturday before each of those Sunday frosts and covered dozens of blueberry bushes and fig trees and plum trees, and I got cherry trees, and even at that, the frost knows how to get into through the cracks and crevices of your cloths. And so even somebody who covered a ton, I still had some of my plantings disrupted. We get early blooming when it gets warm, too soon. For example, the plum trees will flower too quickly. And the minute that frost touches that flower, it kills that flower falls to the ground, and that's your fruit for this year. So before the bees even show up, the tree is pretty and greening, and it won't fruit an ounce for you. That's unfortunate, but that's the nature of being a grower. You learn those kind of things. Remember, the ground is cursed, and God originally gave us food for free. He was going to produce and provide for us, and the fall of man forced it now on us. So the sweat of our brow and the breaking of our back, we would supply food for ourselves. Now, is he the supplier? Yes, he's Jehovah Jireh, but we have to be the ones that supply it. So what I know is that not everything I plant grows. Not every seed I put in the ground germinates. Not every cutting I reproduce takes hold and reroots. And it's just the nature of the environment and the fallenness of man. Knowing what grows in the area really helps you. So you're going to have to go to your growing charts and figure out what you like to grow and then kind of pair that up. I gave you 4 examples there. Beans are planted in the spring, harvested in summer, but carrots are planted in the fall, winter, harvested in spring. Squash is planted around Easter, harvested summer. So different planting seasons and harvesting seasons based on the time of germination and hardening off of plants. And some plants like cooler environments, some plants like more sun, some plants like less sun. And so for those of you that are going to start growing and you're kind of new to this, you really just need to start slowly. That's why I say be simple. Try 1 product, try 2 product, and just try to work your way through that. Obviously, network with us, growers and farmers and people that do this on a more regular basis. Many people ask me, well, how much sun, how much water, how much nutrition, what are the factors of the combination that comprise all that? And I gave you some information at the bottom there, and I don't want to rush through it because I want to take time for question and answer, but what I have learned in my personal experience, in my historical reading, and my understanding of my study, is that the nutrition in the ground is the most important feeder of the plants and products and seeds you put in the ground. And when there's not proper nutrition, the roots can't draw from the nutrition in the dirt, and it can't funnel up the core stems or the canes or the tap roots or whatever, and it doesn't allow it to fully leaf and vegetate and produce and mature crops. So you can water to death, you can have all the sun in the world, but if you're not replenishing the nutrition, if you're not replenishing it on a regular basis, your plants will suck the nutrition out of the dirt, and then from season after season, your production will wane and it won't mature for you. And you scratch your head and wonder why, and it's because you've not nutriented the dirt. So one of the things I got into right away when I started gardening was composting, and I have significant large compost beds where I mix in leaves and tree mulch, and I grind it up with a grinder, and I go get chicken poo and donkey poo, and I get several other animals and our food scraps, we bring it out, and I've got a little process of turning it every 45 days, and boy, the worms get in there and they have fun. And let's just say that the worms have fun and we benefit from that, and that's a good thing. So the stuff's decomposing on its own, and then the worms take care of the rest, and it's like, man, it's a beautiful worm farm, and that's good stuff. And so now I renutrient my own beds. I haven't bought fertilizer in 10 years. I renutrient my own growing every season with my own stuff. And I don't need Miracle Grow anymore. God has shown me how to do it, and we can show you how to do it. I would also tell you to study, because the educator in me says, hey, you got to study, you need to read, it's important to to learn and to grow in knowledge and wisdom and understanding. There's so much out there in gardening and prepping and homesteading, and I've got just a handful of local farmers that have been doing it for a long time that I lean on, and a couple of folks online that I listen to, and that's about all I can handle. And so I don't know it all, but there's certain areas that I really am interested in, so I really dive into those pretty deep. So in some instances, I'm only an inch wide, but I go a mile deep, and I'm okay with that. So network and begin to study for yourself. Now I want to respect your time, but I really want to take question, have discussion, dialogue. So let me just stop with some monologue, and let's take some question and have some observations. Is there anybody that wants to talk or share or ask me something about growing to kind of help jumpstart this? Yes?
I just have a question. From the seed, they said I planted a tomato?
That's a potato, actually.
Potato.
So let me just tell you about this, and then so every year I grow new potatoes, and I grow Idahos, and I grow sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes are totally different. It's a vining, it's interesting character. But when I harvest my potatoes, I take the smallest, the insignificant ones, and I put them in a bucket, or actually it was a container, and I put it in the garage in its darkest, coolest place you can imagine. And then they sit down there from late November, early December until now. I just pulled them out, and they got all these eyes that are growing. Some are literally 2 feet long, and I'll cut the potato slices, and I'll capture every eye that's starting to regrow. And so I did this one about 2 weeks ago. This one 2 weeks ago was, I kid you not, folks, it was only about an inch.
So that was my question.
And so I put it in here, and I allowed it to be exposed to the sunlight. And when the dirt warmed up over the last 2 weeks and the nice weather, it just took right off. So that tells me that it's time to put potatoes in the ground. So I don't need the gardening chart to tell me. I do some of my own testing to know, because dirt warms up differently based upon what we're experiencing climate-wise. But I know now, so I've already started to plant my potatoes. I've got one more round to do. But so this is my guide there. Now go ahead and ask your question.
I think that was the time period that it took to get like that.
So that started at 1 inch, and that's 2 weeks. So potatoes are anxiously ready to get started. Yes, ma'am.
You said you have containers now. Where do you keep all your containers where they're growing and get that much?
Yeah.
In the house?
No. So you mean right now or you mean during the growing
You
season?
have all those plants right there
Oh,
growing
yeah.
and
So-
stuff like that, and I think you said chard.
Yes. So for those that haven't been there, I have 2 what are called growing tunnels, and they're about 6 feet tall, and I built wooden tables in them. And when you go in them, I can button them down. They've got Velcro that the windows go up and down, but basically I can lock it down so the cold air doesn't blow in there. So on my tables, there are hundreds of these right now. In fact, if you come over this weekend, I'll show you hundreds of these where I've started seeds over the past 2 months, and some of them germinated quickly and some of them haven't. This one is called Sunbright Yellow. It's a yellow bell tomato, pepper.
Your tunnels are like a greenhouse?
Yes, so they would be a greenhouse with the exception they don't create the humidity. So they let all the sunlight in, they prevent the cold freezing air and the wind from blowing in. For the most part, they're aging and decaying a little bit. But it also gives me the space to work on tables and do things. Yeah. Good question. Yes, ma'am.
Is yours considered a high tall?
It is. Well, it would be because I can walk right into it. So it's really high. It's about 6-7 feet high, honestly. Yeah.
Well, somebody told us a couple years ago that the government here through the Clemson, that if you have land and you want to use it for agriculture, that they would finance your high tunnel.
There are. I looked into this a few years ago. There are some subsidies available. And if you have there are some where they'll do it for people that are commercializing and monetizing. So if you're intending to be a grower who wants to reproduce and sell at the local markets or some of that, they have a plan for that, but they also have a plan for those of us that don't want to monetize and don't want to commercialize
They
their
have 2
ventures.
different programs for that?
They do, and so you can go to Clemson's Extension And at that website I gave you, there should be a link for some of that. And there's actually, they offered a class at Greenville Tech last year. It was 16 weeks. And it dealt heavily with that. It dealt with a number of things, but that was involved in that as well. I know somebody that took that class and we talked about it. I don't have firsthand experience with it, but I do have secondhand knowledge of it. Yeah. Good. Someone else. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I was gonna ask about food storage. Do you do canning or have root cellar?
Yes and no. So I was raised in a home where my mother pressure canned. I had great experiences, never blew up on her that I'm aware of. But we had a basement up in Ohio, and I can remember those cupboards just full of stuff. And about 10, 12 years ago, my wife and I started making our own applesauce, and then we started making our own strawberry jelly. You know, you can go to the strawberry patch and do you-pick and get all the strawberries you need for a whole year. And then we started freezing it, and then I bought one of those vacuum sealers, and so now I vacuum seal and freeze, because I've got several orchards. I've got all kinds of berries, more than you can imagine. And so we can, and we freeze, and we dehydrate, and I'm a dehydrating fanatic, and I'll grind things down into powders, and I'll crumble it up into, and so my wife's got spices that I give her. So we haven't bought certain spices in years because I supply that to her and for her. And so again, I'm trying to be more self-sufficient, even the smallest things like onion powder or onion flakes, for example. Yes, we if you came to my garage, there's probably 100 more canning jars, lids, and plenty of that on a shelving unit. And we're always looking for that, because canning supplies, there was shortages of canning supplies last year. Somehow COVID affected the canning supplies.
I started a garden, that's what.
Yeah, everybody did. There's a lot of people that did.
Right.
Victory, yes, ma'am. And so, just so everybody's aware, when you cold water bath can, everything lasts about a year. It's designed to be eaten, opened and eaten within a year. Pressure canning is something that can last a decade or more. So, depending upon when you're storing food, if you're storing it to be used over the next 12 months, water bathing is the way to go. It's not only safer, it's easier to do, but you're really kind of intending to use this. So we'll just put stuff, I have a pantry that's dedicated to all our canning stuff that we use. Now, not the food that we make for the kids and stuff, but I have a separate canning pantry. And that's all the stuff we use for the next year. And the stuff we can goes in there and we pull right out of it. Yeah, so we're cycling in and out of it.
Right.
Yes. Great question, thank you. Someone else?
Well, that's part of my question is a canning preserving what you harvest, because you obviously can't eat it all at once.
Yeah.
I will try, but you can't.
No, you can't.
But then also the greenhouse. So you mentioned the air tunnel. What about greenhouses where you can grow, at least theoretically, all year long?
Yes, so let me respond to the first thing, and then I'll come to the second thing. So one of the things I learned as a grower is you gotta stagger your plantings. And I learned the hard way, as I planted all my beans at one time. And then all the beans became ripe and we couldn't eat them all, and this was before we were freeze drying and doing other things. And so I can clearly remember my wife throwing out product that I was growing. I was kind of getting, that little, because I worked really hard at it. But understandably, she was like, bring all this stuff in, we don't know what we're doing. Well, I understood what she was saying, even though I didn't, So what I had to learn to do was I stagger my planting now. So I plant over 3 and 4 weeks, everything I do, so that stuff is coming in sequentially. And I can can and save it, and I can sell it. I do monetize some things, but it makes it easier on us in the way we operate. Now I have a huge blueberry orchard. I have significant red raspberry orchard, and that stuff comes in all once. Now I do have blueberries that stagger, so I have some early season blooming, late season blooming, and mid-season blooming. But red raspberries come in all at once, and then I have 3 different kinds of blackberries, and one's an early, one's a mid, one's a late, so I can pick based on that. So I have staggered those, learning about the different types. But some things you can't. So obviously when the red raspberries are ready, and you just got to go get them all. And I net them because I don't grow them for the birds. So I have a really cool netting system, and you can walk in and you can pick.
Yeah.
and the birds can't get it. And again, you have to plan for these kind of things. So, but I didn't learn how to do that. Somebody else did it, and they just showed me how to do it. So I figured it out by watching someone else. Yeah. Now, I'm not very experienced with greenhouse scenarios. I have my own styles of growing and growing in tunnels during the winter. There's a lot of things that actually will grow in a cooler climate here. You'd be surprised, I can grow spinach really starting in the seeds in October, get them going. They can be coming up November, December, and they may go dormant and slow down, but the minute the dirt starts to warm back up a little bit, they just charge right up. You can grow certain kinds of leaf lettuces and arugula and all kinds of those sort of things, mustards and collards and greens in the wintertime, and they do real well even when the temperatures go down. Now they might slow down and retard a little bit, but the minute it warms back up in the spring. So what happens is if you started early enough at the end of summer, you can capture that crop late fall, and then I don't pull it. I cut it down and leave it there. It springs back up in February, March, and I'm picking that same stuff again. So I plant spinach once, I get 2 pickings from it. I plant lettuce once, I get multiple pickings. And again, if you understand the cycle of those crops, God designed it to do that. We just got to figure it out and use it to our advantage. So thank you for asking. Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about, do you do everything heirloom, like seed to seed, or do you use hybrid while you can? Or do you feel like it messes things up for your heirloom?
Sure. So you learn by experience, and about 8 or 10 years ago, I wanted to start capturing my own seeds, and I clearly remember capturing some pepper seeds and then replanted them the next year, and they didn't turn out the same way as the first year. And then I quickly learned about the F1s and the hybrids, the genetically modified seeds, as I began to study. So over the past 10 years, I've been buying packs of heirloom seeds. I've reached a point now where I collect my own seeds from most of my crops every year. And so the stuff that I've already got planted is actually seed that came from my stuff from last year. So I'm actually doing my own heirloom by heirloom.
So you don't use hybrid anymore? So you've
No.
You've out.
Yes.
Have you found that it's a lot harder to keep them alive? Because I know there's some heirlooms that, they're more prone to root rot and
Sure.
more prone to
So,
all the
and what
bugs
happens is basically you lose this generational genetics. There's enough seed companies that sell heirlooms
Yeah.
that we can buy them from Baker Creek, and dozens of them that are still out there. Now, again, just to talk about seeds for a minute, Big Agra is desperate to put all the minor seed companies out of business. Buy them up, buy the corporate rights, put them out of business because they're genetically creating seeds, and then they own the rights to the DNA of the seed, and they've made sure that the seed won't reproduce next year. And so they want you buying seed from them every year. They want you buying fertilizer from them every year. They want you buying pesticide from them every year. And if you try to save it for the next year, they'll actually sue you because they own the patents on that. The Supreme Court in 1980 allowed them to patent the DNA of a seed. I talked about this at a workshop I did a month or so ago. One of the unfortunate decisions, and so now Big Agra is taken over. But there are, let me go back, not to be Downer, Debbie Downer and Jeff Downer, but there are plenty of heirloom seed companies out there. And so what's a smart thing to do? Each one of you needs a seed bank. Because last summer, when everybody was gardening, I called a few of my seed providing friends around the country. Some of them were out of seeds because so many people had bought, or they were withholding themselves because they saw what was going on. So who would imagine that in the middle of a pandemic that seeds would be hard to find?
How long do the seeds last?
Well, if they're vacuum sealed, they'll sell you 10 and 15 year packages. I've got some seed banks that are in a container that are 25 year. So as I'm doing mine every year, let's say we have some storms or some diseases or whatever, I've also got my seed bank in the house hidden from the world. If I ever need to tap into it, I've got it. But so my goal is to try to reproduce out of my stuff every year, but I've got the safety of a seed bank. And I think that's philosophically about the best I can do there. practically.
If they don't say they're heirloom,
Then don't buy them.
they're hybrid.
Yes. Yeah, and so they're trying to hide that from you. Remember, the legacy media is trying to misdirect you and hide things.
If it is heirloom, it will say heirloom.
And it'll be very evident that because the heirloom providers want you to be aware that this is the real deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got an heirloom corn that's over 100 years old, and I'm trying to save some of those last seeds. And I grew it a few years ago, and I got some more out of it. So I need to plant a couple and get some more out of it. But if anybody likes to grow corn, I'd be glad to give you a couple of those.
Is it true you have to grow corn in 7 rows?
You know, isn't that one of those old wives' tales? I've heard that several times. I find no evidence in the literature that I study, but I don't actually know, honestly. What do you think? Tell me what you think. I don't know. It does take a lot of space. So you got the rows, yes, and you can't do them in raised. They're really hard in raised beds. That doesn't work for me either. Yeah.
Those real pretty
You gotta have in the ground, plow, a lot of space.
Yes, that's a demanding crop. Yes.
Jeff,
Yes, ma'am.
If they're organic seeds, they're not necessarily heirloom.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. It has to say heirloom.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes. So read the back of the package, and you may see the F1 written on it. Well, they may say organically grown, or they may have some organic symbol, and you flip that over and you carefully read the bag. What's that?
Grown in the dirt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, misdirection. You gotta be
They
careful
say
of that.
seed to seed also.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a cue that it's heirloom.
Yeah.
That you can save the seed.
But that phrase heirloom, that connotation is so well known by us around the world that they don't want to hide it. They want to put that out there. So it's going to be stamped right on the front, sometimes in all caps. And when it's not, I get suspicious. That's a classic indicator. Yeah. Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
How many hours a week do you spend?
Ask his neighbors.
If my wife was here, she would respond in one.
Anytime.
I got 3 little ones. I'm still raising youngins too.
Anytime.
Yeah, so, and I'm a professional person, so I actually work for 3 universities, but so going outside and doing this is a hobby to me. It's therapy to me. It's time for me to, it's time, a lot of therapy. It's time for me to spend time with my friend, my daddy, my friend, daddy, God, who's the master gardener. So I have a lot of prayer time in the garden.
He's been out there a while.
So, yeah, I get the farmer's tan. So let me be serious to answer your question. Now that I have a lot of systems in place, I have a lot of things established. Beds, compost beds, berries that are wired, and mulching, the way I mulch things. I don't have to labor today like I did in the establishment of a homestead. But now I was highly motivated. There was, for those that know my story, and it's a long story, but God really moved on me in 2009. And I got on my horse and got my giddy up going. And so I've poured into it for 13 years, but I really labored hard that first 5-6 years to get a lot of my systems established. I had to bring in high quality dirt to fill the beds initially until I learned Hugo culture and a lot of things. I go outside every day for a lot of reasons, but I don't labor in the gardens every day where it hurts my back. And I got a leaky disc, like maybe some of you in here, and I got 3 kids I'm trying to raise for the Lord. So I got a lot of other things I'm engaged in. It doesn't distract me from sometimes the more important things in life, but I do really enjoy it. So I am motivated. I love to come home and get right out there. Yeah. And now that it's warming up, it's so exciting.
Yeah, it is, right?
All that rain we've had, man, this stuff just shot up. Yeah, I'm gonna stay as long as y'all want. Somebody else, yeah.
Rosie, go ahead.
Do you plant things together that grow well? Like I remember reading somewhere about the corn and the beans.
Yeah.
So the beans can grow up the corn. The
Yes.
Indians did that. So do you modernly now find that things grow? Because, and then I've heard about the, I can't remember the flowers that keep the,
Yes.
marigolds.
Yes.
So do you do,
Yes.
is that just learning? You just.
So I've learned what's called companion gardening. And in companion gardening, as some things grow up, like a pepper plant has a canopy. And underneath the canopy, you can plant some herbs, like oregano or parsley or basil. And they work well together. Now I have a little chart that I actually have printed because I can't remember all of those. But generally what you'll find is that most of your products that grow up and have a canopy like a bush bean will then allow for some things in between. Because you plant a bush bean 18 inches to 24 inches apart. You plant your squash and zucchini significantly farther apart, and then you can put things in between them. Otherwise, you've got a lot of soil that's not being utilized. Now, the roots for some of those, I mean, if you've grown zucchini or crookneck squash, you know that the roots grow everywhere, but you can still plant herbs in between all those. My wife loves flowers, so actually somebody mentioned marigolds. At the end of each of my beds, I do marigolds. And I'm attracting bees, I'm keeping away aphids and squash bugs and some other things like that. There is a couple of other, can't think of it offhand, there's a couple of other things that put off a scent that will detract from the squash bugs and some of the other bugs. And I'll make sure that there's some of those in there. I have to rely on paper that I have created. I actually created, through the years I've created kind of what I want, where I want. But yeah, you want to, if you're going to build a bed and you got a lot of rich dirt that you paid for in soil, you want to utilize it. So companion planting, certainly once you really have established your planting style, is the way to go, yeah. So I don't necessarily have to have a dedicated herb garden, because I got a lot of herbs in between everything, and it works great. Thank you for asking.
Did you irrigate? At all?
No, I don't. So I get that all the time, and I don't do drip lines, and I don't do. Now I will tell you that when we have some drought times, I'll pull that hose out there and I'll let the sprinkler go. Particularly when I've got stuff established and it's 4 or 5 days, but now I've got significant rain barrels. And so when I've got new seedlings growing and I just need a little water over here, a little water over there, I got more than enough water. And if anybody's interested in rain barrels, there's somebody in town here who does them really well for a great price. And I'm not pitching for them, I get nothing out of it, but I would gladly refer you to that party. I've taken several of my gardening friends there. But so I have that available for new starts and seedlings. But when we have the drought times, I'm gonna pull the hose out and let the sprinkler run. I got one that broadcasts really far. But I don't do a lot of that because we get a lot of rain here at certain times of the year. And so I'm just kind of tracking in between. You can stick your finger down. If your finger goes 3-4 inches in the dirt and it's bone dry, then those roots are bone dry. But if you can feel that moisture a couple inches in, you really only need to water once a week, maybe twice a week, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, or 1 inch. So as long as I'm getting a rain every so often, and you can start to learn and see when stuff's growing, how it's maturing. You can look at the colors of the leaves and know things like that. Again, that seasoned experience comes with learning and a lot of study also. Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it. Someone else? Yes, ma'am.
Deers and rabbits and
Yeah, critters. So I'm fortunate to have a fenced-in backyard. So the only critters that I get are squirrels. And they tear up my bird feeders a lot. And so I'm not going to kid you. I have a small pellet gun.
Yes.
And I'm teaching my son how to target shoot. And our goal is to scare them away. If you're following my lead. Because we like to have the birds come. I got several bird feeders, and we get a lot of the pretty finches. And the truth is, we like to sit at our table and look out that bay window. And so I don't want my bird feeders torn up. So, but here's what I've noticed: squirrels like Swiss chard. They'll eat the tops of the Swiss chard all the way down. And new broccoli starts, they'll eat the top of the broccoli and leave the stem.
Oh.
But there's very few other things that squirrels will eat in my garden. I don't know what your experience is, and I'd love to hear. But there's only about 3 things that squirrels eat at my place. And broccoli, the very immature starts, when they first start the foliage on top, they'll eat that down and then leave that naked stem there. And they eat all my Swiss chard. So I've got radishes, I've got rutabaga, I've got this, I got 3 kinds of lettuce, and they'll go to the Swiss chard and leave everything else right there. I can't explain it. It's got to be the flavor or the taste. I like Little Debbie's. I don't like, ho-hos. So maybe, when I go into Spinks, I go to the one, the squirrels are the same way. So, yeah, that's fascinating. Does anybody else have a squirrel issue that they deal with? Yeah.
We just, and the finest part, to 2 trees
Hung the feeders on,
and.
yeah, and they won't scale the wire.
Because the lines are too thin.
Oh, they're too thin, yeah, okay.
Okay, so like,
Fishing wire,
not quite,
Yeah.
probably like a 12 gauge wire,
okay,
house wire.
that's a good idea.
Or you can buy the $80 squirrel buster.
I've tried a lot of those, I tell you, they don't all work.
So after a while, they figure it out.
They figure it out.
There's a
yeah.
video, you know, YouTube, this guy's.
The engineer guy who set up the, well, the kids and I watched
watched
that,
it,
yeah.
yeah.
Way too much dude perfect in my household. So I don't have trouble with any other animals, the deers and stuff like that. But now I net all of my berries. So I've got over 100 feet of blackberry that grow. I have nets. I've got 50 feet of 20 some blueberry bushes. I've got 30 feet of red raspberry. I got a few other things. I have to net my elderberry. But so I've designed my own netting, and it's really kind of, I've got it set up where I can quickly pick it up and get under and pick, and netting. But so occasionally a bird will get caught in there. It's unfortunate. I've had snakes get caught in there, black snakes, and I'll free them. I'll free a black snake. I've been bit a couple times by black snakes trying to free it. It'll bite that shit. But that's about it, honestly. And I've done that now 12, 13 years. So I have a wooden fence. I have a 6 feet wooden fence. Goes all the way around the back. Connects to the house. Yeah, nothing gets in
Rose
there.
had a question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
What is your recommendation of the best container? You know, clay, plastic, wood, if you're gonna really
Yeah.
have, you know.
So if you're gonna go larger container, you want styrofoam, because it's light.
Yes.
And when you're gonna move it and you gotta pick it up, now I've got lemon and lime. I've grown lemon and lime in South Carolina for 6 years. I bring them in every time it gets about 45 degrees, and they come into my garage, and as long as they get sun, they're ever bearing, and they keep right on producing.
What about if you're
I'm picking lemons in December
keeping
while
it on
y'all
your
are
front
buying it.
porch? You can't- like I live
So-
in
so-
this neighborhood association. Well, give me a better looking, if that was your
if
first
it
choice,
was
what's
out
your
on the
second
porch
Yeah.
choice?
or something.
Well, so you can go to Lowe's and some of those places, and they've got the plastic ones that are pretty good size. Unfortunately, the inflation on those is huge. I looked at one the other day. It was just to know the pricing. It was like, I don't know, a 20-gallon one or whatever. It was like $25, $30. It was really cost prohibitive. The concrete ones are just super heavy. You put a ton of dirt in those and a big whatever. I mean, you're not gonna be able to move those. So I got some of those I got on the roller things. You can buy those roller things, but the styrofoam are the lightest, and obviously that thin plastic. But unfortunately, what happens is that thin plastic gets weathered, and you start to pick it up, and the lip will break. Those lips will break, and then it's hard to get, And I'm talking about the good size ones. So when I grow lemon and lime, they go in and out every year, and those are in good size ones. Yeah. I don't know where you'd find styrofoam. They're hard to come by. I've got one that's lasted 12, 15 years. If anybody knows, I'd like to know where you get some of those. It's a big one.
Troughs that they use for cattle.
That's become more popular, that cattle trough. Now that's an expensive purchase, and I think you have to assemble it, but you're not gonna get seepage from treated lumber or railroad ties, so if you're scared for chemical seepage, those are taller, so you fill them and you're not have to bend over as far. So I see the advantages to those, and I'm certain they last a lot longer than my wood does. So I don't know where to find them inexpensively. I tend to be rather frugal in my purchasing habits. Tractor Supply, but that's expensive purchase, so yeah. Yeah, yes, sir.
We came from Florida, and I was wondering, is it possible to grow like oranges or grapefruits, can you bring those in and out of the garage? Or?
So the answer is yes. Persimmons grow great in this area, and the Satsuyama orange, which is an Asian orange, and there's a couple of variations of that also grow in this area. I have 2 persimmons and 1 fruits every year, I haven't bought the Satsuyama orange, but I really want to. I just got to figure out where I'm gonna put it. It's really allocation. But those are really the only ones in the Meyer lemon and the Meyer lime that'll grow in this region, even while bringing them in.
Is it possible to do a greenhouse?
Well, that if it's 24/7, 12 months a year, then I would say yeah. I would say you probably have. If you're going to create the climate, then yes, you're probably more likely to be able to grow some of those things. I've always wanted to do clementines, and but I don't know. That's a lot of work and a lot of efforting to see whether or not they take in this region. Yeah, I can show you who I bought the lemon and lime from, and they sell the Satsuyama and some of the other persimmons, some of the things that grow here in South Carolina. I can show you that website and put you in contact with that person. They're in the southern part of the state. They're a commercial seller for that.
So
Yes,
how
ma'am.
big is your garden? Yeah.
It's okay, I'll come back.
I mean, based on the way you're speaking and everything that you're planting, I mean, your grocery bill has to be, insignificant because.
He's got to be kidding.
No, what do you buy?
Sure,
Really?
sure. So, first of all, I'm a really big eater. I know you can't tell. It's very hard. See, when I turn sideways, you can't really see me. But, and I've got a son that eats more than I do, and he's half my size. So, honestly, we eat a lot of what we grow. We do. We do. And so there are some things that my wife has to buy very little of, or we don't buy. I unfortunately love meat. And what are the prices of meat done in the last 12 months? They've inflated. But yeah, so I mean, part of our goal was to be thrifty with what, I don't know how many of you still work professionally, but a lot of people haven't had raises in 4 or 5 years, and it's probably not in sight. So you're falling behind economically quickly. And so we've got to figure out ways to make up the difference. Listen, if they try to clamp down on food in this country, I'm covered.
I know.
And you need to be covered too. You do. I'm not worried about the economics of food. I got it. But you guys need to get there. Remember Henry Kissinger? They're after you. They will use food as one of the ways to do it.
A question I have, you talked about herbs and you talked about peppers and you talked about this and that, but I haven't. When I come in at night to eat, I want a big plate of potatoes or beans or corn or something, so I'm not the guy that goes for the herbs, whatever you say, peppers and such don't much interest me. So what do you grow that takes care of us bigger guys?
Sure. I grow an absolute ton of potatoes. I grow a ton of the Idahos. That's the big ones, big brown. I grow a ton of the new potatoes. That's the small reds. And I love sweet potatoes. I grow a ton of those, and they grow great around here. No, I don't. You got to figure out ways to store them in cold, dry places. I grow, I kid you not, 5, 6 kinds of green beans and black beans and the Asian long bean. If you've ever seen the Asian long bean, I can plant about 2 of them. It'll go up about 30 feet, and the bean will grow down. It's about 2 feet long. It's this wonderful looking bean, but I grow the yellow Indian woman bean, and the bean pod is as big as a penny. I mean, it's big. And my wife makes that 15 bean soup. She'll throw the ham bone in there, and I'll just, so what else do you like? I mean, I like to grill zucchini and squash, crookneck squash. I like to grill those. So I grow my own eggplant, big, beautiful, purpley. I grow black-eyed peas. I grow Crowder peas, and I grow Alaskan peas. Alaskan peas grow in the cooler climate, and the Crowder peas are midsummer.
You're doing all this in raised beds?
Yeah, so all your peas trellis up. So imagine cattle panels, and they just go right up the panel, and they pick.
In the meantime, until they do, you can get all these really inexpensively, the beans and the rice and stuff, and make sure you have it in your storage, in your pantry, until you can get it growing, because
we have tons of that.
Do it now.
Yeah, so if you're looking for, if you're familiar with the LDS, the Latter-day Saints, they're very good at teaching their people preparedness annually. They've created manuals for that. Well, all around the country, the LDSs have their own cannery. And they basically produce 25 years shelf life food for the members of the LDS church. But a number of years ago, they opened up their canneries to the public. I've personally gone down to Atlanta and I bought twice from the LDS cannery in a little community in North Atlanta, and you can go in there and they got a list, and they've got these number 12 cans that are sealed with flour and sugar and this and that. I bought bags of beans and bags of this, and if any of you are interested, I'm about ready to make another trip down there, but so if you want to get that stuff now and get that long-term shelf stuff preserved, and then start to learn how to grow, where you feel good about that in the short term,
Where is that you were talking about?
There's two of them. There's one in Columbia, and they have limited hours. And I go down to the northern side of Atlanta, and I don't remember the community. I have to look it up every time. Did you go down with me one time? We wanted to go down.
We're gonna
but-
go. We can get the information
Yeah,
to
we
you.
can get the information
We'll get
to
it.
you. Yeah,
We'll
I've
get it
been
to
down there twice and bought. And so because it's a ministry, it's very inexpensive pricing compared to what you'd see in the supermarkets or in Walmart.
What's the organization?
Well, the LDS is the Latter-day Saints. They have canneries around the country. Now, they produce it all in Utah, and then they send it to the canneries to distribute to basically their church members first. But they've opened up as a ministry to the public, and you and I can go in and buy, or you can go on their website and buy, and they'll ship it to you for an extra few dollars. I love to go down. It's the joy of me and a group of men going down. We have fun and going down, come back with our purchases.
And it's all packaged so it lasts.
Yeah, so the big number 12 cans that are vacuum sealed, they're 25 years shelf life, the big Mylar bags of beans and rice and dried potatoes, and I mean just a whole slew of those.
It's still affordable.
Yes, very affordable, because they do it as a ministry for their church members first and foremost. Yes.
Field trip, Greg, field trip.
Field trip, yeah. Road trip. Yes, sir.
Activity for the women.
On the radio, they advertise pastry,
so I'm
Activity for us.
food.
Yes.
So I'll build shelves in the garage and make it.
It's basically like ski rations that
Yeah.
the army uses.
Yeah. Yes, and I bought some of those when they first came out. When that organization first launched, they were doing a 2-week supply for $9.99, and they'd only let you buy 2 a week, so I was buying 2 a week for a long time. I got a couple of boxes. There's lots of those emergency food rationing organizations out there, and you can buy the buckets and you can buy all kinds of things, and it's not a bad thing to have a few of those. They're more expensive now than ever. Amana is a good one out of Michigan, but they're a little expensive because they know there's a premium on that and there's demand. Wherever there's demand, you're going to have price inflation. So, and they've not been able to meet supply, so they control the margin there. So, but it's expensive. You can learn how to do it. I learn to create your own buckets now. Dry stuff out.
So how,
Yes, ma'am.
how big is your garden? How big-
Sure. So I have 0.6 acres
Right.
fenced in, and most of that's in the back. So you take the house and the frontage away. What is that? Maybe 0.4 tenths of an acre. And I've got 6 raised beds. I've got all along the fence line on the inside is where all the orchard pieces are. I even have a little bit of a woods where there's some other things, but I still have plenty of backyard to mow, and the kids play. I have teeter-totter and swing set and tree house, and so honestly, it's honestly not as much space as you think. I give garden tours probably 1 or 2 a week, and
You should take pictures.
any of you are interested to come by, I'd be more than happy to welcome that. But Dan, I think, has some pictures. He came in this week and took a few.
Yeah.
Is he proud
Yeah.
of your backyard with a camera? I'd kick him out.
I charged him. I'm in the business of doing business. I charged him for that. Just don't tell his pastor I did that. Whoever you see, please, you
You
know.
walk by to the top of his head. Oh, Jeff's back there.
Yes, ma'am.
I just have a note,
Yeah.
the Baker Creek company that you,
Yeah.
the heirloom seed, FYI, I ordered my catalog from them in January. It came 2 months, the catalog.
Yeah,
Came 2 months. A friend of mine tried to order it the day she saw it, out
Yeah.
till 2023. So a lot of people are doing this. So they're only available online. So Baker Creek, and so there's a lot of products that they have that you now can only order
That's a
online.
big one.
That's
So
a big
there are
one.
some
There- yeah.
small ones. There's a small heirloom seed provider here in South Carolina, and I could certainly give you that information, but they're not as well known. So therefore, they probably have more product in stock because of the brand recognition isn't there. Baker Creek has such strong brand identity that it makes sense that they were sold out. Yeah. Plus, they're probably conserving some stuff back because they have to sell to make their bottom line on a regular basis. You know, make payroll, for example. So they would hold back product on a regular basis.
So, some of those other names, could you?
I can share the ones that I'm familiar with and that I've trusted. So I bought from 3 or 4 that I've trusted. I would be glad to provide those to Dan. Yeah, yeah. I don't mind doing that. Yep. Yes. Someone else. Good conversation. Appreciate the dialogue. So it's not all
Mosquitoes,
monologue.
how do you control them in those barrels, rainwater?
Sure. So the first barrel I had a significant opening at the top. And I got a ton of mosquitoes. And I bought those little donuts that you put in there. I was always a little hesitant about those because I didn't know the chemical composition of those. Even when I tried to investigate those, I didn't get very far, which was a little disheartening. If you understand the investigator side of me, that's disappointing. So, the new barrels that I've moved to, the only opening is the screen on top, and that screen is so tight, I don't think they can get in there, honestly. Now I've only had these barrels for a year now, and so I haven't done any draining or cleaning of them, so there may be a few that get in there, but I'm not using that for drinking water. So it's just, they're 55 gallon each, thank you for asking, and they're connected. I got 2 connected, so the downspout fills one, it spills over in the other, and the third one I gotta go straight into a hydrangea that loves water. So I'm feeding this hydrangea, boy, it's blowing up, so it gets, because that guy used to burn out all the time, and so I figured out I'm just gonna push the excess water right into him, and now he's super happy. But for those of you that are considerate of water, get you some Berkey water filters and some extra charcoal. I've got 2 of those. And so if I was ever to bring that water into the garage in a short-term necessity, I could run it through the Berkey and it would take care of all that. Yeah, thank you for asking, appreciate that. Someone else. My time is your time.
I was just gonna say,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
have a compost bin, I never turn it or anything, I never know what it's gonna grow every year.
Scraps grow, scraps regrow. You get a lot of good stuff out of it. You can just transplant right out of that. Yeah, that's a growing bed.
It's wonderful.
Surprise!
You never know.
We bought a real fancy one that you can turn and turn, you know.
Oh, yeah.
I let it go too long and I went to go and it was like gone. Everything had just totally
Oh,
dissipated. It was
right
like
into the ground.
gone. It was, so use it, yeah.
That's awesome. I turn mine about every 45 days, about a month and a half. And I have a chipper, so leaves, tree mulch, stuff that's left over from last year, I'll grind it down with my chipper, and it accelerates the decomposition process. I have, every couple of years, I'll have the tree guys, when they come in the area and they're chipping, I'll have them dump a big load right in front of my gate, and I'll wheelbarrow it down to the bottom of my, and I have a huge bin, and I just let that stuff sit in there all year and it decomposes. And then after a year or more, I bring it up, because you don't want to mix it in right away, it'll rob nutrition out of your composting. But let that stuff die down while you're doing everything else. Now I've got constant nutrition that I can bring up and mix in. And I was just down there this week, and stuff is just gorgeous. Oh my goodness, I was digging into it with my pitchfork. It was just like
Gorgeous?
black gold. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Sorry, Jeff. How many worms were in there?
It was hardy.
Oh.
Yeah,
And
so
go
you
fishing. Go fishing.
yeah, you get fishing worms, we can sell them too. Somebody else.
Or you give the worms to the chickens.
We live,
Yes,
we live
yeah.
in the mountains,
You
and
fancy.
so we don't get, because of the trees in the mountains, we don't get that 6 to 8 hours, we get whatever that is. So, but we've got, so we had other challenges probably trying to grow, if we were to put
Yeah.
gardening, including all of our rock binders, AKA shovels, every time you stick it in the ground, you come up with rock. But we have tons of leaves, and we've got worms, we've got red wigglers, we've got, you turn the leaves over and they're flopping all over the place. Do you eat worms? I'm kidding, but that helps.
No, but I'll tell you what, so in this instance, in clan living, we're gonna barter. And,
I got a chainsaw to take the trees down.
yeah, well, there we go. But, you bring me leaves, and worms, and I'll trade you for food, so we grow for each other and support one another. You know, so what I can't grow, maybe someone else is, and we're working together. So again, I'm not worried about the economics of society, because we're creating our own system.
Yeah, much to their.
Yes,
That's my answer.
yes.
Freaking for fishing,
That's right, yeah.
That's good.
And bring a rake with you.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring up the grow bags here. Can be used on patio or deck.
Yeah, so I mean, if you got 6 or more, if you got 6 hours, so there's some things that grow in 6 hours or less. A lot of herbs grow in 6 hours, and I know you like me, but if you can grow potatoes in partial shade, I've grown potatoes in partial shade, and they do just fine. So if you can't get, you can do potatoes in a bag this size. You can do potato mounds and potato towers, those kind of things, and they do just fine. I've taken some great big barrels and cut them in half, cleaned them out, and I've grown in potato barrels. I've seen people use tires for it. So there's a variety of methods, and you don't have to go into the ground. You can build up off of that. So you need to find where you can get that maximum of 6 or 7 hours, and then grow in that space. Or just barter with others.
If we could ever get that whole, move them out maybe, but that's hard.
It is, I
Sell the
understand.
worms
Trees,
for
that's not
food.
fair.
Sell the worms for food.
I have a friend who
Yes.
she's an avid gardener, and she makes hers on wheels so that she can move where the sun is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an idea.
In the grass, out in the backyard?
Yeah, it
Wow.
was, yeah, she had all her garden for years, and these trees grew up so high, they totally shaded
Yeah.
the space she had established, and so she just moved it, she put down gravel and pea gravel for drain off,
Yeah, yeah.
and she put them in like the Tractor Supply, big horse troughs, and then she puts them on wheels and keeps them,
Roll them around.
moving
Yep, yep. So she relocates based on the
Yeah,
sun,
really-
yeah, the setting.
anymore.
No?
She's chasing her.
She's laboring.
No, no.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm
Chasing the
just
sun.
saying, it's
Yeah.
not all day.
No.
She has to-
That is really nice.
She has a system in place, yeah. Good stuff, people, I appreciate that. My little daughter, Rebecca, here is my middle daughter, and we've just made a fresh batch of Blackberry Jelly, and I brought some. So I would ask you to support local growers. We are selling that. We sell that every year. Blueberry jam and blueberry marmalade and fig preserves, but all I have available is the blackberries. So if you're interested in taking some of that home, just see my daughter Rebecca on your way out. And I appreciate your time. I'm gonna stick around. If you guys want to ask more questions or talk, I'll be more than happy to. I really thank you very much.